فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So far we've been able to speak about Maryam in different ways and different roles. We spoke about her as a daughter, we spoke about her as a model, and today I want to speak about Maryam as a teacher. So if we go to the next verse in Ali Imran, so in chapter 3, verse 37, we see that Maryam now grows up and she is accepted within the caretaking of Zechariah or Zakariyya. And Zakariyya in the Qur'an comes to Maryam, and he notices something. So the verse reads, whenever Zechariah went in to see her in her sanctuary, he found her supplied with provisions. He said, Mary, how is it you have these provisions? And she said, they are from God. God provides limitlessly for whoever he will. So what we see in this particular verse is that Maryam is put into the caretaking of Zechariah, and every time, as the Arabic says, كُلَّمَا دَخَلَ عَلَيْهَا زَكَرِيَّا الْمِحْرَابِ وَجَدَ عِنْدَهَا رِزْقًا. So he sees that she has some type of rizq or sustenance, and many of the commentators say this sustenance is something that is out of season. It's not something that was normally given at that particular time of the year. And he asks her, قَالَ يَا مَرْيَمْ أَنَّ لَكِ هَذَا. He said, how is this possible that you have this? And then she says, مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ. This is something from God. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَرْزُقُ مَن يَشَاءُ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ. And that God has the ability to provide a rizq to whoever he wills without any limit. And this is very much connected to one of the names in the Islamic tradition of God, Ar-Razaq, or the Sustainer. What we see here is that even though Maryam is put in the caretaking of Zakariyya, and Zechariah is there watching over her, it's in fact God that's providing her the sustenance. And in some ways, the roles are flipped. Zakariyya is supposed to be this person who is looking over Maryam, but actually Maryam is looking over herself and has this direct relationship with God that supersedes her relationship with Zakariyya. We also see that this lesson that Maryam gives to Zakariyya actually will lead him to make his own prayer for a child. And in the next couple of verses, he'll return to God and he'll ask God, oh God, please give me a child. And he's eventually given the child of Yahya or John. Now here we see that Maryam is accepted within the mystical tradition, which is generally understood to be the Sufi tradition, but there's many different names. You can use Tazkiyat an-Nafs, or the purification of the soul, or generally talking about the ghaib or the unseen. And the Sufis in many ways emulated Maryam because she had possession of miracles and this direct relationship with God. Specifically, the Sufis loved Maryam, the Immaculate Mother who gave birth to the spiritual child, Jesus. She's often taken as a symbol of the spirit that receives divine inspiration, thus becomes pregnant with the divine light. So Sufis really love this idea of direct communication with God, and how, as we'll see later, one of the angels came, Gabriel, and touched Mary and blew his spirit within her, and she became pregnant. So one of the questions Sufis ask is, how can all of us be touched by God, and how can all of us be touched by the divine spirit? We also see that Sufis generally celebrate the angelic touch that led to her pregnancy and the eventual birth of a righteous prophet and message bearer. Thus, for Maryam, her spiritual role as a female receptacle is fully accepted, and her pregnancy and birth are seen as part of her divine struggle. Unlike other Near Eastern philosophies, many Sufis held that motherhood and its various struggles from pregnancy to labor were part of a spiritual journey. So even though she was a female and a mother, those things are actually praised within mystical thought and also within studies of purification of the heart, that her struggle to have this child, whether it's actually through inception, to the actual pregnancy, to the labor, are all celebrated and part of one's spiritual journey. Maryam would thus become an exemplar of the nature of the feminine ideal, which was further connected to the so-called feminine aspects of God, such as mercy or rahmah. The story of Maryam provides ample material for those of mystical and Sufi persuasion, as the story is full of miracles, angels, and the divine. As we see here, Maryam is someone who has her own miracles. She's touched eventually by an angel, and she's given this divine command to have the baby Jesus or Isa. Because of Maryam's spiritual role, she became a model for other females, specifically female spiritual figures and Sufis, who were drawn to her mystical and miraculous nature. Arguably the most famous of these is Rabi al-Adawiyya, who lived in the 2nd century of Islam and died in 801 of the Gregorian calendar. The renowned female mystic, who is frequently depicted in the light of Maryam, she's described as the one accepted by men, as the second spotless Maryam. Similar to Maryam, Rabi did not have any mentioned spouse and devoted herself to piety and worship. She fits the model of a celibate woman whose only care and concern is the love, grace, and mercy of God. For instance, in one famous story, in the streets of Basra, she was asked why she was carrying a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. And she most famously said, "I want to throw fire into paradise and pour water into hell, so that these two veils disappear." And it becomes clear who worships God out of love, not out of fear of hell or hope for paradise. And this story really represents the Sufi or mystical branch of Islam, where it's not only about consequence or reward, but about creating this intimate relationship with the divine. Rabi is further described as lost in love, union, deputy of Mary, Maryam, the pure, accepted by men. Here the writer sees Rabi in the model of Maryam, and even as her deputy. Rabi is absorbed in the love of God and was even accepted among men, similar to how Maryam was accepted by Zakariyya. For instance, just like Maryam taught Zakariyya a lesson regarding reliance on God, Rabi teaches the men around her spiritual lessons that then were narrated and transmitted to others. Rabi also fits the trope of a teacher, specifically a teacher to older men who were religious authorities. For instance, classical scholars describe Rabia as endowed with reason and possessed a unique ability to conceptualize and express important truths. She was known to say words of wisdom or aphorisms in which ethical and theological principles are expressed in short, pithy sayings. Each saying was meant to challenge a listener and push them to think in deeper and more spiritual terms. So Rabia is not known to be a hafidha, or someone who memorized the Qur'an, or a muhaddith, as someone who relayed prophetic traditions, but she is someone who was a spiritual figure. And what we remember about her is a short saying she said to people to have them reflect on their spiritual state and connect to God. Moreover, while Maryam taught Zakariyya, Rabia also taught older figures such as the famous Sufyan al-Thawri. Sufyan met Rabia at the end of his life and was a noted traditionalist who had spent decades collecting and disseminating traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. Sufyan accompanied Rabia when he was an older, disillusioned man who had political trouble with the authorities and suffered from various physical ailments. Similar to Zakariyya, who had given up hope in having a son and having progeny, Sufyan had given up hope on finding peace and security. Furthermore, Zakariyya and Sufyan both spoke from a position of scholarship and religious authority, while Maryam and Rabia spoke from direct experience of faith, spirituality, and mysticism. In one story, Sufyan raises his hands and prays, "O God, grant me safety." However, after he makes this prayer, Rabia weeps and cries, leading him to ask why she's crying. She responds that he, Sufyan, makes her weep, making him defensive and asking how. She then responds, "Have you not learned that true safety from the world is to abandon all that is in it?" So how can you ask for such a thing while you're still soiled and preoccupied with the world? Similar to Maryam, Rabia teaches Sufyan a spiritual lesson. To find safety in the world is in fact to abandon it, and not to give it more focus than it deserves. The safety that Sufyan so much desires is not in his physical surroundings, but rather his mental state that gives the world more than it warrants and deserves. Like other mystical women, Rabia was a mentor, mu'addiba, to men and women, part of a group of specialized teachers in the various Islamic sciences, ustada, who address mixed audiences. So what we see here in this particular story, as well as in our discussion on Maryam, is that Maryam inspires others, whether that is men and women, as we discussed in our previous session, but also she inspires a group of female mystics and scholars who are interested in purifying their heart and the discipline of purification of the soul. And Maryam begins to inspire other women to start teaching and sharing the spiritual lessons in her life. And what we see also in this particular verse of Maryam teaching Zakariyya about God is that she receives her own miracles. One of the themes in biblical and Quranic literature is that the protagonists, whether you think of Moses, Musa, or Ibrahim, they all have their own miracles that they share. And miracles in many ways are a demonstration of how the divine favors and loves a particular person. Moses, for instance, comes with his staff, or in the Qur'an, he puts his hand into his shirt and it comes out as white. This is a demonstration that God is supporting him in his divine mission. In a similar way, we see that Maryam has her own miracles, which is independent of the other figures in her life, whether that be Zakariyya, or later on we see with Jesus, Isa. We also see that Maryam is not only a daughter, she's not only a model, but she's a teacher. Zakariyya, who is older than her, comes and speaks to her and asks, Maryam, where did you get all these provisions? Where did you get all these fruits? And then she explains to Zakariyya that she received them from God, and he has the ability to give sustenance to whoever he wills. This leads to epiphany for Zakariyya, that he can himself can reach out to God and he can make a prayer. And this leads him to make the prayer for a child, and he's given the son of Yahya and John. So it's important as we move forward to see Maryam as a spiritual guide and teacher to those around her. And we see that Maryam becomes a model for people throughout history, as we'll see later on with Rumi. That Rumi, in his famous poetry, he will look at Maryam and he will be in awe of her spiritual state, how she accepted the divine command, how she accepts the divine messenger, how she's touched by an angel, and how she eventually fulfills the command of God. So Maryam is not only a figure that precedes Jesus, but throughout Islamic history, she is a model in herself. And lastly, for me, looking at this story and reading this verse and talking about Rabia, it makes me reflect, because I, in many ways, identify with Sufyan al-Thawri. I identify with Zakariyya. I myself am a professor, and I am educated in the scholarly tradition. I have a PhD in Arabic Islamic studies, and it's easy for maybe someone like myself to stand up in front of people and say, I have the particular knowledge, I have the textual tradition, I have memorized this Quranic verse, or I know this prophetic tradition. But these stories make us remember that spirituality may exist anywhere. Spirituality and spiritual lessons may not be with the person who has that degree or has memorized all those traditions. But spirituality may exist with your students. It may exist with your children. It may exist with staff. It may exist with people who you normally do not understand or would think have lessons to teach you. And I think this story in particular makes us focus on the idea that spirituality can exist anywhere, and that a seeker is someone who, when they interact with everyone, even average everyday people, are looking for lessons that they can learn and implement within their lives. Thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I would encourage you to visit my website, dryunusmirza.com, to learn more about my research and my blogs. This specific podcast was based on one of my blog posts on Rabia Adawiyya, who's considered to be the deputy of Maryam, and I'll put that link into the show notes. And I would encourage you to send me an email. Tell me if you have encountered an instance like this, where you found spirituality in a place that you weren't expecting, or morals and lessons that you can live your life by through the average person. I would encourage you to join my newsletter, where we can be in touch and you can learn more about this podcast and my forthcoming book on the Islamic Mary. Thanks once again, and take care.